Sometimes the most broken souls find each other in the most unlikely places. In 1887, a towering rancher named Barrett Callahan made a choice that would forever change his understanding of honor and redemption. When a desperate gambler couldn't pay his debts, he offered a young woman as payment. Barrett took her in, not knowing she was actually a European princess hiding from those who wanted her dead. This quiet woman carried secrets that would bring danger to his ranch. Armed men would come looking for her, old enemies would resurface, and Barrett would have to decide how far he'd go to protect someone who'd become more than just a responsibility. What started as a simple debt collection became a fight for survival and something deeper than either expected. But how does a princess end up as payment for a poker game? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1887 had been merciless to the town of Dry Hollow, Arizona Territory. Dust devils danced across the main street like restless spirits, and the sun beat down with a fury that made even the hardiest souls seek shelter in whatever shade they could find. The town sat in a natural basin, surrounded by red rock formations that trapped the heat like a giant clay oven, baking everything within its boundaries to a crisp brown. Barrett Callahan stood 6 feet 6 inches in his worn leather boots, a mountain. Of a man whose shadow could cool a horse on the hottest day, his hands, scarred from years of hard living and harder choices, wrapped around a worn poker chip, his lucky piece from the old days when luck was the difference between a warm meal and a cold grave. He'd been rolling that chip between his fingers for the better part of an hour, watching the afternoon light slant through the dusty windows of Murphy's saloon. The saloon itself was a monument to frontier pragmatism, rough-hewn timber walls that had seen their share of bullet holes, a bar made from a single piece of oak that had somehow made its way west in a covered wagon, and chairs that had been repaired so many times they looked like patchwork quilts. The smell of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies created an atmosphere that was equal parts welcoming and threatening, depending on your business there. Barrett had been coming to Murphy's for 3 years now, ever since he'd hung up his guns and bought the ranch 15 miles outside town. The transition from feared outlaw to cattle rancher hadn't been easy. There were still men who looked at him with a mixture of respect and wariness, remembering the stories that had followed him across the territory like a shadow he couldn't shake. "Your move, Callahan," growled Silas Morton, the traveling gambler, who'd been working the frontier towns for the better part of a decade. Morton was a thin man with nervous eyes and hands that shook just enough to make Barrett wonder if it was from drink or fear. Tonight, it was probably both. Barrett glanced at his cards. A decent hand, nothing spectacular, but enough to stay in the game. Around the table sat 4 other men. Doc Harrison, the town's physician who played poker like he performed surgery with steady hands and careful calculation. Jake Muller, who owned the general store and played with the conservative approach of a man who counted every penny twice. Tom Bradley, a ranch hand from the Double R spread who bet with the reckless enthusiasm of youth. And Morton, who was sweating despite the evening breeze that had finally begun to stir the stifling air. The pot had grown to more money than most of these men saw in a month. Barrett had been winning steadily, his years of reading men's faces, serving him well at the card table, just as they had when his life depended on knowing when someone was about to draw on him. But Morton was in deeper than his pockets could cover, and Barrett could see the desperation growing in the man's eyes like a fever. "I need to see that bet and raise you 50, Barrett said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made strong men think twice about crossing him in the old days. He pushed the money forward, coins clinking against each other with a sound like distant church bells. Morton's face went pale, then flushed red. His hands trembled as he looked at his cards, then at the pot, then at his cards again. The other men at the table had long since folded, content to watch the drama play out between the former outlaw and the desperate gambler. "I don't have 50, Morton admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "Then you fold," Doc Harrison said matter-of-factly, already reaching for his hat. It was getting late, and the doctor had patients to check on in the morning. "Wait," Morton said, desperation making his voice crack like a teenager's. "I've got something else, something valuable." Barrett raised an eyebrow, his fingers still working the poker chip. In his experience, men who claimed to have something valuable usually didn't, especially men who found themselves on the wrong side of a poker debt in a frontier saloon. "I'm listening," Barrett said, though his tone suggested his patience was wearing thin. Morton's eyes darted toward the saloon doors, then back to Barrett. "She's outside, in my wagon. Young woman, maybe 22, 23 years old. Clean, well-behaved, knows how to work." He licked his lips nervously. "I won her in a game up in Tucson. She's worth more than $50, I can tell you." That, the other men at the table shifted uncomfortably. Even in the rough frontier territory, where human decency was often as scarce as water in a drought, there were lines that decent men didn't cross. Apparently, Morton had been walking those lines for some time. Barrett's jaw tightened, and his hand stilled on the poker chip. He'd seen enough of the world's ugliness during his outlaw years to know that desperate people did desperate things. But something about Morton's offer sat in his stomach like bad whiskey. "You're talking about a person," Barrett said slowly, his voice carrying a warning that made Morton shrink back in his chair. "It's legal," Morton said quickly. "Got papers and everything. Indentured servant, fair and square. She owes a debt, and I hold the marker. Nothing improper about it." Barrett studied the man's face, reading the lies mixed with the truth like reading sign on a trail. Morton might have papers, but Barrett doubted they were worth the paper they were written on. Still, if this woman was truly in Morton's custody, leaving her with him would be condemning her to whatever fate awaited her in the next town. "Bring her in," Barrett said finally. "Let me see what you're offering as collateral." Morton practically jumped from his chair, hurrying toward the doors with the eagerness of a man who saw salvation within his grasp. The other players exchanged glances, but no one spoke. They all knew Barrett's reputation, and they all knew that whatever happened next, it wouldn't end well for Morton if he was lying. The gambler returned a few minutes later, followed by a young woman who moved with a grace that seemed out of place in the rough saloon. She was dressed simply, a plain brown dress that had seen better days, worn boots that had walked many miles, and a shawl that she clutched around her shoulders like armor. But it wasn't her clothing that caught Barrett's attention. It was her bearing. She walked with her spine straight and her chin up, despite the circumstances that had brought her here. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, but strands had escaped to frame a face that spoke of intelligence and strength. Most telling of all were her eyes, deep brown like rich coffee, and filled with a calm dignity that reminded Barrett of still water running deep. "This is her," Morton said, his voice taking on the tone of a man trying to sell a horse at market. "Elena, she doesn't talk much, but she's a hard worker, good with cooking, cleaning, mending. She'd be worth her keep on any ranch." Elena, if that was truly her name, said nothing, but Barrett caught the slight tightening around her eyes at Morton's words. She was listening, understanding, and judging. Whatever her circumstances, this woman was no simple servant. Barrett stood, his full height making Morton take an involuntary step backward. Up close, Eleanor barely came to Barrett's shoulder, but she didn't shrink away from him as he studied her face. Instead, she met his gaze steadily, and in that moment Barrett saw something that made his decision for him. Fear, not of him, but of what would happen if he walked away and left her with Morton. It was carefully hidden behind that dignified mask, but it was there, and Barrett recognized it because he'd seen it in his own mirror during the dark years when he'd been running from his past. "The bet stands," Barrett said, sitting back down and laying his cards on the table. "Full house, queens over tens." Morton's face crumpled as he revealed his hand. A pair of eights and nothing else. The man had been bluffing with desperation as his only ally, and now that bluff had been called. "She's yours, then," Morton said, practically throwing the papers at Barrett before grabbing his hat and heading for the door. "And good riddance." Barrett watched the man go, then looked at the papers. They were, as he'd suspected, nearly worthless. A hastily written agreement that probably wouldn't hold up to any serious legal scrutiny, but they were enough to give him some claim to responsibility for the woman's welfare, at least until he could figure out what to do with her. Eleanor had remained, standing throughout the entire exchange, her hands folded in front of her, watching everything with those intelligent eyes. Now she spoke for the first time, her voice carrying a slight accent that Barrett couldn't quite place. "Mr. Callahan, I assume." Her tone was respectful but not subservient, educated but not condescending. "I understand I am now in your debt." Barrett studied her face again, noting the way she pronounced his name, the careful formality of her speech. This woman had education, breeding, things that didn't match with being Morton's property or collateral in a poker game. "You're not in my debt," Barrett said, standing and tucking the papers into his vest pocket. "But you are my responsibility now, at least until we can sort this situation out properly." He gestured toward the door. "I've got a ranch outside town. You're welcome to stay there until we figure out what comes next." Something shifted in Elena's expression, surprise perhaps, or relief. She nodded once, a graceful acknowledgement that somehow managed to convey both gratitude and dignity. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan. I am grateful for your kindness." Barrett picked up his winnings from the table, nodding to the other men who were already preparing to leave. As he and Elena walked toward the door, he found himself wondering what story had brought this clearly educated woman to such circumstances. Whatever it was, he suspected it was far more complicated than Morton's simple tale of indentured servitude. The evening air was cooler now, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Barrett's horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Charlie, waited patiently at the hitching post. Morton's wagon was already disappearing down the dusty street, the gambler apparently eager to put distance between himself and whatever consequences might follow his desperate bet. "Can you ride?" Barrett asked Elena as he untied Charlie's reins. "Yes," she replied simply, then added, "though I haven't ridden in some time." Barrett nodded and helped her up onto Charlie's broad back, then swung up behind her. As they rode out of Dry Hollow toward his ranch, he found himself acutely aware of the woman sitting in front of him. The way she held herself even on horseback, the faint scent of lavender that seemed to cling to her despite her circumstances, and the careful way she observed everything around them as if memorizing the landscape. The Rocking Sea Ranch lay in a valley sheltered by red rock formations and fed by a year-round spring that made it one of the most valuable pieces of property in the territory. Barrett had bought it with money saved from his outlaw days, money he'd never had to explain too carefully to the previous owner, who'd been eager to sell and head back east to family. The ranch house was simple but well built, constructed of local stone and timber, with a wide porch that caught the evening breeze. Corrals and outbuildings dotted the property, and Barrett could see his small herd of cattle moving slowly across the pasture like dark shapes against the twilight. As they approached the house, Elena spoke again. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, and Barrett heard something in her voice, a wistfulness perhaps, or a recognition of something she'd lost. "It's home," Barrett replied, surprised by the truth of those words. For a man who'd spent years never staying in one place longer than necessity demanded, the concept of home had been foreign until he'd found this valley. He helped Elena down from Charlie's back and led the way onto the porch. Inside, the house was sparse but comfortable. A main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a hand pump that drew water from the spring, 2 bedrooms, and a small study where Barrett kept his books and the few mementos from his past that he couldn't bring himself to throw away. "You can have the back bedroom," Barrett said, lighting an oil lamp that cast warm shadows on the walls. There's a wash basin and clean linens. Tomorrow we can talk about what you'd like to do next." Elena nodded, but as she moved toward the bedroom, she paused and turned back to face him. In the lamplight, her face seemed to glow with an inner strength that made Barrett wonder again about her true story. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "I want you to know that whatever Morton told you about my circumstances, the truth is likely more complicated than he understood." Barrett studied her face, seeing honesty there, along with carefully guarded secrets. "Most truths are more complicated than they first appear," he said. "We'll sort it out in time." She smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her face completely. For just a moment, Barrett caught a glimpse of what this woman might be like when she wasn't carrying the weight of whatever had brought her to Morton's wagon, and ultimately to his ranch. "Good night, Mr. Callahan," she said, "and thank you again." "Good night, Elena." As she disappeared into the bedroom, Barrett found himself standing in his main room, rolling the old poker chip between his fingers and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Outside, the night sounds of the desert began their familiar chorus, coyotes calling across the distance, the rustle of wind through sage, and the soft lowing of cattle settling down for the night. Barrett walked to the window and looked out at his land, thinking about the woman now sleeping under his roof. She was hiding something, that much was certain, but whether it was dangerous or merely painful remained to be seen. What he did know was that she didn't deserve whatever fate Morton had planned for her, and that was enough for now. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, as tomorrow always did in the territory. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he cared to remember, Barrett Callahan didn't feel quite so alone in his valley sanctuary. 3 days passed in relative peace at the Rocking Sea Ranch. Elena settled into the household routines with an efficiency that surprised Barrett. She cooked meals that reminded him of flavors he'd forgotten existed, mended shirts with stitches, so fine they seemed like artwork, and moved through the house with a quiet grace that somehow made the place feel more like a home than it ever had. But Barrett was a man trained to notice things, small details that others might overlook, subtle changes in the wind that could mean the difference between safety and danger. And he was beginning to notice things about Elena that didn't add up with Morton's story. The way she held herself when she thought no one was looking, straight-backed and regal, like someone accustomed to deference rather than servitude. The careful way she spoke, her accent becoming more pronounced when she was tired or distracted, carrying hints of European education and refinement. Most telling were her hands, soft despite the calluses she was developing from ranch work, with fingernails that spoke of recent care and a pale band around her ring finger where something valuable had recently been removed. On the morning of the 4th day, Barrett was mending fence in the north pasture when he saw the dust cloud on the horizon. In Arizona territory, dust clouds usually meant one of 3 things: cattle, weather, or trouble. This one was moving too fast and in too straight a line to be cattle, and the sky was clear of storm clouds. That left trouble. Barrett dropped his tools and whistled for Charlie, who came trotting over with the reliable response of a horse who'd learned to trust his rider's instincts. As he swung into the saddle, Barrett's hand automatically checked the Colt 45 at his hip, a habit from the old days that had kept him alive through more close calls than he cared to count. The dust cloud resolved into 3 riders moving at a steady pace toward the ranch house. Barrett urged Charlie into a gallop, his mind already calculating distances and angles. If these men meant trouble, Elena would be alone at the house with nothing but a shotgun that he wasn't even sure she knew how to use. He reached the ranch house just as the 3 men were dismounting near the front porch. Barrett could see Elena through the kitchen window, and he was relieved to note that she'd had the sense to stay inside. These weren't neighbors come calling. Everything about their bearing and the way they wore their guns suggested men who were comfortable with violence. "Help, you gentlemen with something?" Barrett called out as he rode up, his voice carrying the deceptive calm that had preceded more than one gunfight in his younger days. The leader of the group was a tall man with prematurely grey hair and eyes like winter ice. He wore his gun low and tied down, and his clothes were too clean for a man who'd been riding hard across desert country. The other two were clearly muscle, thick-set men with scarred faces, and the kind of watchful stillness that spoke of experience in unpleasant work. "Name's Garrett," the leader said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was polite in form, but somehow managed to feel threatening. "We're looking for someone. Young woman, dark hair, about 23 years old. Goes by the name of Elena." Barrett kept his expression neutral, though his grip on Charlie's reins tightened slightly. "This is a big territory, mister. Lot of young women with dark hair. You might want to be more specific about what your business is with this particular one." Garrett's smile was thin as a knife blade. "Our business is our own, but I can tell. We're prepared to pay well for information about her whereabouts." He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded paper. "Maybe you recognize this face." Barrett leaned forward to look at the paper, a wanted poster, though not the usual kind issued by territorial marshals or county sheriffs. This one was privately printed, offering a substantial reward for information leading to the capture of a woman matching Elena's description. But the name on the poster wasn't Elena. It was Sarah Mitchell, and the charges listed were theft and fraud. "Can't say I've seen her," Barrett said, handing the poster back. "But like I said, this is big country. You might try asking in town." "Already did," one of the other men spoke up, his voice carrying a slight accent that Barrett couldn't place. "Saloon keeper mentioned you had a guest recently, woman you won in a poker game." Barrett's jaw tightened. Murphy and his big mouth. The saloon keeper had never been able to resist sharing gossip, especially when money might be involved. "That's right. Indentured servant named Elena. But she moved on yesterday, headed east toward Tucson, with a family that needed household help." It was a smooth lie, delivered with the kind of casual confidence that Barrett had perfected during his outlaw years. But Garrett wasn't buying it. Barrett could see the disbelief in those cold eyes, and the way the man's hand had moved slightly closer to his gun. "Funny thing about that," Garrett said. "We checked with the stage line and the freight companies. Nobody matching her description has left town in the past week." His smile grew colder. "Now I'm thinking maybe you're not being entirely truthful with us, Mr. Callahan. The fact that Garrett knew his name wasn't necessarily surprising. Barrett's reputation had a way of preceding him, even after 3 years of trying to live quietly. But it did suggest these men had done their research before riding out to his ranch." "I'm thinking maybe you boys should move along," Barrett replied, his voice dropping to the tone that had made grown men reconsider their life choices in saloons from Texas to California. "This is private property, and you're not welcome here." Garrett laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's where you're wrong, Callahan. See, we know all about your reputation. Used to be quite the gunfighter, from what we hear. But that was years ago, and you're just one man against 3. Now, we can do this easy, or we can do it hard, but we're going to search that house." Barrett's hand moved to his gun in one fluid motion, the old reflexes coming back as naturally as breathing. "I don't think so." The tension stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. 4 men sizing each other up in the way that predators do when they're deciding whether the fight is worth the potential cost. Barrett had been in this situation before, outnumbered, but holding the high ground, both literally and figuratively. The key was projecting absolute confidence, making the other side believe that starting a fight would cost them more than they were prepared to pay. Inside the house, Eleanor appeared at the window, and Barrett caught a glimpse of her face. She was pale but composed, watching the confrontation with the kind of focused attention that suggested she understood exactly what was at stake. "Tell you what," Garrett said finally, his hand still hovering near his gun. "We'll leave now, but we'll be back. And next time we might bring more friends. Think about whether protecting this woman is worth dying for, Callahan, because that's what it's going to come to." Without waiting for a response, Garrett jerked his head toward his companions, and the three men mounted their horses. But as they prepared to ride away, Garrett called out one more time, "Oh, and Callahan, that woman you're protecting, she's not who she says she is. Ask her about the Van Hollen family. Ask her why there's a price on her head from people with enough money to make your life very unpleasant." With that, the three men spurred their horses and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and the promise of future trouble hanging in the desert air. Barrett watched them until they disappeared over the ridge, then dismounted and walked to the house. Elena met him at the door, and he could see that she'd heard at least part of the conversation. "They were looking for me, weren't they?" she said quietly. Barrett nodded, studying her face. "They had a wanted poster. Called you Sarah Mitchell. Claimed you were wanted for theft and fraud." Elena closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, Barrett saw something new there. Resignation mixed with a deep weariness that spoke of running for a very long time. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "I think it's time I told you the truth about who I am and why those men want me dead." Barrett looked at her, this woman who'd brought grace and warmth to his house, who'd worked beside him without complaint, who was clearly far more than she'd initially appeared to be, and made his decision. "Come on then," he said, gesturing toward the kitchen table. "Let's hear it, all of it." As Elena began to speak, Barrett found himself rolling that old poker chip between his fingers again, thinking that sometimes the biggest gambles in life had nothing to do with cards and everything to do with the people you chose to trust. Outside, the desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the promise that their peaceful days at the Rocking Sea Ranch had just come to an end. Elena sat across from Barrett at the rough-hewn kitchen table, her hands folded carefully in her lap. The afternoon light streaming through the window caught the gold threads in her dark hair, and Barrett found himself thinking that even in a simple work dress, she carried herself like royalty. As it turned out, there was a reason for that. "My real name is Elena Van Hollen," she began, her voice steady but quiet. "My mother is Baroness Catherine Van Hollen of the Austrian Netherlands. The Van Hollen family has held lands and title for over 300 years. She paused, watching Barrett's face for any sign of disbelief or mockery, but found only patient attention. 3 months ago, my uncle Marcus attempted a coup within our family's holdings. My mother had been managing the estate since my father's death 5 years past, and she'd made changes that some of the old families didn't appreciate. Modernizing the mining operations, improving conditions for the workers, establishing schools for their children." Elena's voice took on a bitter edge. "Uncle Marcus believed such progressive ideas were weakening our position and making us vulnerable to political upheaval." Barrett reached for the coffee pot and poured 2 cups, sliding one across the table to Elena. She wrapped her hands around it gratefully, as if drawing strength from its warmth. Marcus had allies, other noble families who feared change, investors who profited from the old ways, and unfortunately, some very dangerous men who weren't bound by any code of honor. Elena took a sip of coffee, steadying herself. "When diplomacy failed to change my mother's policies, they resorted to more direct methods. There were 3 attempts on my life in as many weeks." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Barrett found himself studying Elena's face with new understanding, the careful way she observed her surroundings, the slight tension he'd noticed in her shoulders, the way she always positioned herself near exits. She'd been living like a hunted animal. "The last attempt was at our family's estate outside Brussels," she continued. "A bomb in my carriage, meant to look like an accident. If our driver hadn't noticed the suspicious package and thrown himself from the carriage to examine it..." She trailed off, her composure cracking slightly. "But you got away," Barrett said gently, encouraging her to continue. "My mother's advisors convinced her that I needed to disappear completely while they dealt with Marcus and his allies. They arranged for me to travel to America under an assumed identity, Sarah Mitchell, a merchant's daughter seeking employment." Elena's laugh was hollow. I was supposed to reach San Francisco, where friends of the family would provide sanctuary until it was safe to return. What went wrong? Silas Morton. Elena's voice hardened. He was on the same ship, and he recognized me from a newspaper photograph that had been published after one of the charity galas. Morton saw an opportunity for profit. He could ransom me back to my family or sell information about my location to the highest bidder. Barrett's jaw tightened as the pieces fell into place. So he created those papers, claimed you as his property. Was cleverer than I gave him credit for, Eleanor admitted. He knew that a missing European noble would attract attention from authorities, but an indentured servant could disappear into the American frontier without anyone asking difficult questions. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Barrett was on his feet immediately, his hand moving to his gun as he peered out the window. But it was only Jake Mueller from town, his wagon loaded with supplies. "Stay inside," Barrett told Elena as he walked out to meet Jake. "Afternoon, Barrett," Jake called out, tipping his hat. "Brought those supplies you ordered, plus some extra. Ammunition, like you asked." The storekeeper's face was troubled. "Also thought you should know, those 3 strangers who were asking questions around town yesterday, they're still there, holed up at the hotel and making folks nervous." Barrett helped Jake unload the supplies, noting the extra boxes of cartridges for his rifle and pistol. "What kind of questions were they asking?" "About you, mostly. Your past. How long you've been at the ranch. Whether you've had any visitors." "Lately." Jake lowered his voice. "Barrett, I don't know what kind of trouble those men represent, but they've got the look of professionals about them. The kind that don't give up easy." After Jake left, Barrett carried the supplies into the house, his mind already working on defensive preparations. Elena had remained at the kitchen table, but he could see that she'd been watching through the window. "Those men won't give up," she said quietly. "They're not just bounty hunters working for reward money. My uncle has resources, enough to hire the kind of men who don't quit until the job is done." Barrett set down the box of ammunition and looked at Elena directly. "Then we need to make sure you know how to protect yourself." For the next 2 hours, Barrett taught Elena the basics of handling firearms. They started with his father's old Winchester rifle, a weapon that had served the Callahan family well during the Indian Wars and Barrett's own troubled years. The rifle was well maintained, its metal gleaming with careful attention, and it felt solid and dependable in Elena's hands. "The Winchester was my father's," Barrett explained as he showed her how to load and aim. "He always said a rifle was like a good horse. Take care of it, and it'll take care of you." Elena proved to be a surprisingly quick learner. Her hands, though soft from her privileged upbringing, were steady and sure as she worked the rifle's action. More importantly, she approached the lessons with the serious attention of someone who understood that her life might depend on these skills. "You've done this before," Barrett observed, as Elena placed 3 shots within a respectable grouping. "On the target he'd set up. My father believed in practical education," Elena replied, lowering the rifle. "He taught me to ride, to shoot, and to think strategically. He said that knowledge was the only wealth that couldn't be stolen." Her voice grew soft with memory. "I wish I could ask his advice now." As the afternoon wore on, Barrett found himself impressed not just by Elena's quick mastery of the rifle, but by her calm acceptance of their situation. She didn't complain about the danger or demand to be taken somewhere safer. Instead, she asked practical questions about the ranch's defenses, the best escape routes, and how to make their position more defensible. "The house sits well," she observed, studying the approach from the main trail. "Good visibility in all directions, water from the spring, and those rock formations would make it difficult for anyone to approach unseen." "You think like a general," Barrett said, surprised by her tactical assessment. "My father was a colonel in the Austrian army before he inherited the title," Elena replied. "He taught me that the best defense is understanding your enemy's options and limiting them." That evening, as they prepared a simple dinner, Barrett found himself studying Elena with new appreciation. The frightened woman who'd stood silently in Murphy's saloon was gone, replaced by someone who was clearly noble by birth, but also practical and resilient by necessity. "Elena," he said, as they sat down to eat, "I want you to know that whatever happens, you're safe here. Those men will have to go through me to get to you." She looked up from her plate, and Barrett saw something shift in her expression. Gratitude, certainly, but also something deeper. Trust, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. "Why?" she asked quietly. "You don't owe me anything. You could turn me over to them and collect whatever reward they're offering." Barrett considered the question, rolling that familiar poker chip between his fingers. Why was he willing to risk his life for a woman he'd known less than a week? The answer, when it came to him, was both simple and complicated. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because I've spent too many years running from who I used to be. Maybe it's time I stood and fought for something worthwhile." Outside, the desert night settled over the ranch like a familiar blanket, bringing with it the sounds of coyotes, and whined through sage. But tonight, Barrett found himself listening for other sounds: the approach of horses, the creak of leather, the subtle noises that might herald the arrival of men with guns and bad intentions. Tomorrow, he decided, they would begin preparing for a siege. The attack came just before dawn, when the desert air was still cool and the first light was painting the eastern sky pale gold. Barrett had been expecting it. Men like Garrett rarely waited long to make good on their threats, and the advantage of surprise was worth more than comfort to professionals. Barrett was already awake, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and his Colt within easy reach, when he heard Charlie whinny from the corral, a sound of alarm that cut through the morning stillness like a warning bell. He moved to the window and caught a glimpse of movement among the rocks above the ranch, the brief flash of sunlight on metal that meant rifle barrels. "Elena," he called softly, and she appeared immediately from the back room, already dressed, and carrying his father's Winchester with the competence of someone who'd spent the evening practicing. The sight of her, calm, prepared, ready to fight, stirred something in Barrett's chest that he hadn't felt in years. "How many?" she asked, moving to the side window where she could watch the approach from the south. "At least 3, maybe more," Barrett replied, checking his rifle and the extra ammunition he'd laid out the night before. "They're positioned in the rocks above us, good fields of fire, but it means they'll have to come down eventually if they want to finish this." The first shot came through the front window, shattering the glass and sending fragments across the kitchen floor. Barrett and Eleanor dropped to the floor immediately, and Barrett felt a moment of fierce pride at how quickly she'd reacted. This wasn't a pampered noble who would freeze in danger. This was a woman who understood that survival meant adaptation. "They're trying to pin us down while someone flanks around back," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. She'd positioned herself where she could watch both the rear approach and provide covering fire for Barrett. "Classic military tactic," Barrett nodded, impressed again by her tactical knowledge. "Can you handle the back approach while I deal with the men in the rocks?" "Yes." Eleanor's reply was simple and confident, and Barrett found himself trusting her completely despite knowing her for less than a week. There was something about the way she'd handled herself during their preparations, calm, competent, and utterly focused, that reminded him of the best soldiers he'd served with during his younger days. Barrett moved to the front room, keeping low as more shots peppered the walls around him. Through the shattered window, he could see muzzle flashes among the red rocks above the ranch. 3 positions, maybe 4, with good overlapping fields of fire. Whoever had planned this assault understood both the terrain and basic military tactics. He waited for a lull in the firing, then rose quickly and sent 3 well-aimed shots toward the nearest muzzle flash. The return fire was immediate and intense, forcing him back to cover, but he'd seen enough to confirm his suspicions. These weren't random bounty hunters or local troublemakers. They moved and fought with the coordination of military veterans. From the back of the house, he heard Eleanor's Winchester bark once, then again in rapid succession. A moment later, she called out, "One down back here, but there are more coming through the arroyo." Barrett felt a surge of fierce admiration, mixed with something deeper, a protective instinct that went beyond simple chivalry or duty. Elena was holding her own in a firefight that would have terrified most people, man or woman. But more than that, she was fighting for her own survival with a courage that spoke to the core of who she was. The battle continued through the morning, a deadly game of movement and counter-movement as their attackers tried different approaches, and Barrett and Elena adapted their defense accordingly. The house proved to be as defensible as Elena had observed. The stone walls stopped most rifle rounds, and the wide porch provided good fields of fire in all directions. During a brief lull, Barrett managed to work his way around to Elena's position at the back window. She was reloading the Winchester with smooth, practiced motions, and he could see a graze along her left arm where a bullet had come too close. "You're hit," he said, reaching for his handkerchief to bind the wound. "It's nothing," Elena replied, but she allowed him to wrap the cloth around her arm. As he worked, Barrett was acutely aware of her nearness, the warmth of her skin, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the way she watched his face while he tended to her injury. "Elena," he began, then stopped, unsure of what he'd intended to say. She reached up with her free hand and touched his cheek gently, her fingers cool against his skin. "I know," she said quietly. "I feel it too." The moments stretched between them, an acknowledgement of something that had been building since the day she'd arrived at his ranch, something that went beyond protector and protected, beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. Then another volley of shots shattered the silence, and they were back to the deadly business of survival. But something had changed between them in that brief touch, a connection that made the danger feel less isolating and the fight more worthwhile. As the sun climbed higher, Barrett began to notice a change in the pattern of their attackers' fire. The shots were coming less frequently, and he could hear voices calling to each other from positions that seemed farther away than before. "They're pulling back," Elena observed, echoing his own assessment. "Why?" Barrett studied the terrain through the broken window, his mind working through the tactical possibilities. Either they're running low on ammunition, or they're planning something else. Professional fighters don't usually give up this easy. The answer came an hour later, when Jake Mueller's wagon appeared on the main trail, approaching the ranch at a careful pace. Barrett could see that Jake wasn't alone. Doc Harrison sat beside him on the wagon seat, and there were at least 3 other men riding alongside. "Cavalry," Barrett murmured, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. As the wagon drew closer, Barrett could see that their attackers had indeed withdrawn. The rock formations above the ranch were empty of muzzle flashes, and the desert had returned to its normal stillness. Jake pulled up near the house and called out, "Barrett! You folks all right in there?" Barrett opened the front door cautiously, his rifle still ready. "We're fine, Jake. What brought you out here?" "Tom Bradley rode into town about dawn. Said he'd heard shooting from this direction," Doc Harrison replied, climbing down from the wagon with his medical bag. "Figured you might need some help." As the townspeople gathered around, Barrett found himself explaining the morning's events, while Doc Harrison examined Elena's wounded arm. The story he told was carefully edited, bounty hunters looking for Elena over some trumped-up charges, a case of mistaken identity that had escalated into violence. But as Barrett watched Elena interact with the well-meaning townspeople, he realized that their troubles were far from over. Garrett and his men might have withdrawn for now, but they wouldn't give up, and next time they'd come better prepared and with more men. That evening, after the townspeople had left and the ranch had settled back into its familiar rhythms, Barrett and Elena sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Elena's arm was properly bandaged now, and she'd changed into a clean dress, but Barrett could still see the effects of the day's battle in the set of her shoulders and the watchful way she scanned the horizon. "They'll be back," she said quietly, voicing what they both knew. "Yes," Barrett agreed, "but next time we'll be ready for them." Elena turned to look at him, and in the fading light, Barrett saw something in her eyes that made his heart beat faster. Trust, affection, and something deeper that neither of them had yet put into words. "Barrett," she said, using his first name for the first time, "whatever happens, I want you to know that I'm grateful, not just for your protection, but for reminding me what honor looks like." Barrett reached for her hand, feeling the calluses she'd developed from ranch work, the strength in her fingers that spoke of resilience and determination. "Elena, you've reminded me what it feels like to fight for something worth protecting." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they sat together in comfortable silence, both knowing that greater challenges lay ahead, but finding strength in their growing bond. Tomorrow would bring new dangers and difficult decisions, but tonight they had each other and the knowledge that some things were worth fighting for. 2 weeks passed without another direct assault on the ranch, but Barrett knew better than to mistake the quiet for safety. Garrett and his men were still in the area. Jake Muller reported seeing them in town regularly, asking questions, making inquiries, and clearly planning their next move. The temporary peace felt like the calm before a thunderstorm, heavy with unspoken threats and gathering danger. During this interlude, Barrett found himself watching Elena with growing fascination, the woman who had stood silent and submissive in Murphy's saloon had revealed herself to be someone entirely different, intelligent, resourceful, and possessed of a quiet strength that complemented her obvious breeding. She moved through the ranch house with an efficiency that spoke of practical experience, yet every gesture carried the unconscious grace of someone raised in luxury. It was while they were working together to reinforce the ranch's defenses that Elena finally revealed the full extent of her noble heritage. Barrett was boarding up the broken windows when she emerged from the house carrying something wrapped in an old dish towel. "Barrett," she said, her voice carrying a formality that hadn't been there in days, "there's something I need to show you. Something that will help you understand exactly what we're facing." She unwrapped the towel to reveal a ring, not large or ostentatious, but clearly valuable. The gold was worked in an intricate pattern that spoke of old-world craftsmanship, and set into its face was a deep blue stone surrounded by smaller diamonds. But it was the engraving on the stone that caught Barrett's attention, a coat of arms, featuring a rampant lion and a castle tower. "This is the Van Hollen signet ring," Elena said, her voice quiet but steady. "It's been in my family for 12 generations, passed down through the eldest child regardless of gender. My great-grandmother wore this ring when she negotiated mining rights with the Habsburg crown. My mother wore it when she modernized our estates and established the schools and hospitals that so angered my uncle." Barrett took the ring carefully, feeling the weight of centuries in the small piece of jewelry. "Why are you showing me this now?" Elena's expression grew troubled. "Because those men who attacked us, they're not just bounty hunters working for reward money. They represent something much more dangerous." She paused, seeming to gather her courage. "My uncle Marcus didn't just attempt a family coup. He's been working with a consortium of investors and political figures who want to reverse all the progressive changes my mother implemented. They're not interested in capturing me for ransom. They want me dead so that the Van Hollen inheritance will pass to Marcus unopposed." The implications hit Barrett like a physical blow. "How much money are we talking about?" "The Van Hollen estates control copper mines, steel mills, and shipping interests across 3 countries, Elena replied. "The annual income alone would fund a small army. And that's exactly what Marcus is planning to do with it. Fund political movements that will restore the old power structures and eliminate the reforms my mother fought for." Barrett studied the ring in his palm, understanding now why men like Garrett were willing to pursue Elena across an ocean and into the American frontier. This wasn't about one woman's life. It was about controlling wealth and power that could influence the politics of nations. "There's more," Elena continued, and Barrett could see the weight of secrets in her eyes. "My mother isn't just a progressive noble trying to improve conditions for her workers. She's been secretly funding democratic movements across Europe, helping to organize resistance against the old autocratic systems. If Marcus gains control of the family fortune, he'll use it to crush those movements and restore the kind of oppressive rule that my parents spent their lives fighting against. Barrett handed the ring back to Elena, watching as she slipped it onto her finger, where it settled with the familiarity of long wear. So, this is about more than your life. It's about the future of democratic reform in Europe. Exactly. Elena's voice carried a burden that seemed too heavy for someone so young. And that's why Garrett and his men will never give up. They're not just working for my uncle. They represent interests that have unlimited resources and no scruples about using violence to achieve their goals. Barrett absorbed this information, his mind already working through the tactical implications. An enemy with unlimited resources changed everything about their defensive strategy. They couldn't simply wait for the attack to come to them. Eventually, sheer numbers and superior equipment would overwhelm any defense they could mount at the ranch. "We need help," he said finally. "Professional help." Elena nodded, apparently having reached the same conclusion. "I've been thinking about that. During my journey to America, my mother's agents mentioned contacts in San Francisco, people who might be able to help if the situation became desperate. That's 800 miles through hostile territory," Barrett pointed out. "And Garrett's. People will be watching every route." "I know." Elena's voice was steady, but Barrett could see the fear she was trying to hide. "But staying here means eventual defeat. They'll keep coming with more men and better weapons until they overwhelm us." Barrett walked to the window and looked out at his ranch, the land he'd worked to build into something peaceful and productive, the home he'd created after years of running from his past. The idea of leaving it, possibly forever, felt like tearing away a piece of his soul. But as he turned back to Eleanor, seeing the courage she was drawing from some deep well of strength, Barrett realized that the ranch was just property. What mattered, what was worth fighting for, was standing right in front of him. "There might be another option," he said slowly. "I've got contacts of my own, men from the old days who owe me favors." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "What kind of men?" Barrett smiled grimly. "The kind who know how to fight when the odds are stacked against them. The kind who understand that sometimes you have to take the battle to the enemy instead of waiting for them to come to you." That evening, Barrett wrote 3 letters by lamplight while Eleanor watched from across the kitchen table. Each letter was addressed to a different man in a different part of the territory, but all 3 messages were essentially the same. A call for help from someone who'd once stood beside them when the chips were down. "Will they come?" Eleanor asked. "Has Barrett sealed the last letter with wax?" "They'll come," Barrett replied with more confidence than he felt. The men he was writing to were old companions from his outlaw days, men who'd ridden with him when they were all younger and more reckless, before time and hard living had scattered them across the West. Whether they were still alive, still willing to fight, or still loyal to old friendships remained to be seen. But as Barrett looked across the table at Elena, noble by birth, but tested by hardship, courageous in the face of overwhelming odds, and somehow more beautiful to him than any woman he'd ever known, he realized that he'd call in every favor, risk every friendship, and face any danger to keep her safe. The ring on her finger caught the lamplight, a reminder of the centuries of honor and responsibility she carried. But it was the woman wearing the ring, not the title or the wealth it represented, that had captured his heart. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of distant rain and the promise of change. Tomorrow, Jake Muller would carry the letters to town and ensure they reached their destinations. And then Barrett and Elena would wait to see who answered the call and whether old loyalties would prove stronger than new dangers. Whatever happened next, Barrett knew that his peaceful days as a reformed rancher were over. The past he'd tried to leave behind was about to catch up with him, and this time he was going to embrace it fully. The first of Barrett's old companions arrived 3 days later, just as the sun was setting behind the red rock formations that surrounded the ranch. Barrett spotted the lone rider while he was checking the cattle in the north pasture, and even at a distance, he recognized the easy, confident way the man sat his horse. Frank Morrison looked older than his 42 years, his face weathered by wind and sun, his hair gone mostly grey at the temples. But his eyes were still sharp as a hawk's, and the matched colts at his hips looked as well maintained as they had 15 years ago, when he and Barrett had robbed their last bank together. "Barrett Callahan," Frank said as he dismounted near the ranch house, his voice carrying the hint of a smile. "Never thought I'd see the day when you'd settle down to pushing cattle." "Frank Morrison," Barrett replied, clasping his old friend's hand. "Never thought I'd see the day when you'd answer a call for help without asking about the pay first." Frank laughed, a sound that brought back memories of campfires and shared dangers from their younger days. "Maybe I'm getting sentimental in my old age, or maybe I figure I still owe you for that business in Tucson." Eleanor appeared on the porch, and Barrett saw Frank's expression change as he took in her bearing and obvious refinement. This wasn't the kind of woman Frank would have expected to find at a frontier ranch, especially one owned by a reformed outlaw. "Frank, I'd like you to meet Eleanor Van Hollen," Barrett said. "Eleanor, this is Frank Morrison, one of the finest men I've ever had the privilege to ride with." Elena descended the porch steps with that unconscious grace that marked her noble breeding, extending her hand to Frank with perfect courtesy. "Mr. Morrison, I'm honored to meet you. Barrett has told me a great deal about your friendship." Frank took her hand briefly, his eyes flicking to Barrett with a raised eyebrow that clearly asked what kind of trouble his old friend had gotten himself into this time. But his response was polite and respectful. "Pleasure's mine, Ma'am, though I suspect there's more to this story than Barrett's letters let on." Over dinner, a simple meal of beef stew and cornbread that Elena had prepared with her usual skill, Barrett filled Frank in on the complete situation. He held nothing back, explaining Elena's true identity, the political implications of her uncle's conspiracy, and the professional nature of the men who were hunting her. Frank listened without interruption, occasionally asking sharp questions that showed he understood both the tactical and strategic challenges they faced. When Barrett finished, Frank sat back in his chair and whistled softly. "Well, Barrett, you never did do anything simple," he said. "European nobility, international politics, unlimited resources on the other side." Frank looked at Elena with new respect. "Ma'am, I hope you understand what you're asking. These aren't local troublemakers or territorial disputes we're talking about. This is the kind of fight that could get us all killed." Elena met his gaze steadily. "Mr. Morrison, I understand perfectly, and I want you to know that I would never ask anyone to risk their life for my sake if the stakes weren't so high. This isn't just about my survival. It's about preventing my uncle from using my family's resources to crush democratic movements across Europe." Frank studied her face for a long moment, then turned to Barrett. "She's not what I expected. She's not what anyone expects," Barrett replied, pride evident in his voice. "That's part of what makes her special." The second man arrived the next morning. Tommy Brennan, red-haired and still quick to laugh, despite the lines that hard living had carved around his eyes. Tommy had always been the youngest member of their group, barely 18 when he'd first ridden with Barrett and Frank. Now 33, he'd retained his boyish enthusiasm but gained the steady competence that came from years of surviving on the frontier. "Barrett, you old devil," Tommy said as he dismounted, grinning broadly. "When I got your letter, I thought someone was playing a joke. Barrett Callahan calling for help? The man who never asked for anything from anybody?" "Times change, Tommy," Barrett replied, returning his friend's embrace. "We all get older and maybe a little wiser. Or maybe we just find something worth fighting for," Tommy said, his eyes already assessing the ranch's defenses with the automatic awareness of a man who'd lived by his wits and his gun. Elena emerged from the house carrying a hand-drawn map, and Barrett felt a surge of admiration as he watched her interact with these rough men from his past. She treated them with the same courtesy she would have shown European diplomats, yet without a trace of condescension or artificiality. "Gentlemen," she said, spreading the map on the porch table, "I've been studying our defensive position, and I believe we need to discuss our options." The map was remarkably detailed, showing not just the ranch buildings and immediate terrain, but also approach routes, defensive positions, and potential escape paths. Barrett realized that Eleanor had been making careful observations during her weeks at the ranch, mentally cataloging every tactical advantage and vulnerability. "This is military-quality reconnaissance," Frank said, studying the map with professional appreciation. "Where did you learn to do this kind of work?" "My father was a career officer before he inherited his title," Elena replied. "He believed that strategic thinking was as important as social graces for someone who would inherit responsibilities for thousands of people." Tommy leaned over the map, tracing one of the approach routes with his finger. "These positions here, they're where the men hit you before?" "Yes," Barrett confirmed. "Good fields of fire, but they had to expose themselves to get into position. Next time they'll come differently," Frank observed. "More men, better coordination, probably at night to reduce our visibility advantage." Elena nodded, pointing to several locations on the map. "That's why I think our best option is to force them to fight on ground of our choosing, rather than waiting for them to attack when they're ready." Barrett looked at his old friends, seeing the same thought reflected in their faces that had occurred to him. Elena wasn't just a noble lady in need of protection. She was a strategic thinker who understood warfare as well as any of them. "What do you have in mind?" Frank asked. Elena's finger traced a path on the map, leading away from the ranch toward a narrow canyon about 5 miles to the east. "There's a place called Devil's Gate, a natural choke point where a small force could hold off much larger numbers. If we can draw them there, we'd control the terms of engagement," Tommy finished, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "Make them come to us through terrain that favors defense." Frank was studying the map more carefully, his experienced eye noting details that less experienced fighters might miss. "It's risky. If they don't take the bait, or if they have more men than we expect, we could find ourselves trapped in that. In a canyon with no way out, all our options are risky at this point," Barrett said. "But Elena's right. Waiting here for them to attack when they're ready means fighting on their terms." That evening, as the 3 men shared stories and planned in their strategy, Barrett found himself watching Elena with growing wonder. She participated in their tactical discussions as an equal, offering insights based on her unconventional education and showing a grasp of military principles that impressed even Frank's cynical professionalism. But it was during a quiet moment, when she was refilling their coffee cups, that Barrett realized how completely she'd won over his old companions. These were men who'd trusted few people in their lives, who'd learned to be suspicious of outsiders, and especially wary of anyone who claimed noble birth. Yet here they were, treating Elena with the same respect and acceptance they'd have shown a long-time member of their group. "Barrett," Frank said quietly, when Eleanor had gone inside to clean up after dinner, "that woman is something special. I hope you realize what you've got." "I'm beginning to," Barrett replied, watching through the window as Elena moved around the kitchen with efficient grace. "The question is whether we can keep her alive long enough for it to matter." Tommy looked out at the desert darkness, where somewhere their enemies were planning their next move. "Well, we've faced long odds before," he said, "and we're still here." Frank nodded grimly. "The difference this time is that we're not fighting for money or excitement. We're fighting for something that actually matters." As if summoned by their conversation, Eleanor appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm lamplight. "The 3rd man you wrote to," she said to Barrett. "When will he arrive?" Barrett's expression grew troubled. "Miguel Santos was always the most dependable of us, but also the most cautious. If he's coming, he'll be here. If he's not," Barrett shrugged, "then We make do with what we have. Elena nodded, understanding the implications. 3 men against professional killers with unlimited resources was barely better than 2, but it was what they had. Sometimes, Barrett reflected, courage wasn't about having good odds. It was about standing up when the odds were terrible. But the cause was right. As the night settled over the ranch, bringing with it the familiar sounds of desert creatures and distant wind, Barrett found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. A month ago, he'd been a simple rancher trying to forget his violent past. Now he was preparing for what might be the most important fight of his life, and, for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. Miguel Santos arrived on the 4th day, but he didn't come alone. Barrett spotted the dust cloud from 2 riders approaching from the south while he was working with Frank and Tommy to prepare additional ammunition for their planned confrontation. At Devil's Gate, something about the way the riders approached, cautious but not furtive, direct but alert, told Barrett that one of them was Miguel. Barrett was right. Miguel Santos looked much the same as he had 15 years ago. Compact, wiry, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of a man comfortable with both violence and hard work. But the woman riding beside him was a complete surprise. She was perhaps 40 years old, elegantly dressed despite the dust of hard riding, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical but refined style. Her bearing spoke of authority and education, and the way she sat her horse suggested someone accustomed to both luxury and hardship. Most striking were her eyes, the same deep brown as Elena's, with the same intelligent intensity. Barrett's confusion lasted only until Elena emerged from the house and saw the approaching riders. The young woman stopped dead in her tracks, her face going pale as moonlight, then flushing with a mixture of joy and disbelief. "Mother." Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried across the yard clearly enough for everyone to hear. Chate, elegant woman, dismounted with fluid grace and walked toward Elena with tears streaming down her face. "My dearest daughter, my brave, foolish, wonderful girl." The reunion was unlike anything Barrett had ever witnessed, a collision of relief, love, and desperate gratitude that seemed to illuminate the entire ranch yard. Mother and daughter clung to each other as if afraid that letting go would cause one of them to disappear, and Barrett found himself deeply moved by the raw emotion of their embrace. Miguel approached Barrett while the women were reuniting, his expression mixing satisfaction with concern. "Barrett, my friend, I hope you're prepared for some very complicated news. I figured as much when you showed up with European nobility," Barrett replied, clasping Miguel's hand. "How did you find her?" "She found me," Miguel said. "Tracked me down in Santa Fe through contacts who knew about my past association with you. Apparently, she's been following Elena's trail across half the continent." Frank and Tommy had approached during this conversation, and Barrett made the necessary introductions. Miguel Santos had been the strategist of their old group, the man who planned their operations and usually kept them from walking into traps. His presence meant they had a real chance of outthinking their enemies. When Elena and her mother finally separated enough to speak, Elena led the way to the ranch house, her arm around her mother's waist, as if afraid the older woman might disappear. "Again, Barrett," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion, "I'd like you to meet my mother, Baroness Catherine Van Hollen." The Baroness turned to Barrett with the composed dignity of someone accustomed to meeting important people, but her eyes showed genuine warmth and gratitude. "Mr. Callahan, I cannot begin to express my gratitude for what you've done for my daughter. Miguel has told me something of your situation here, and I understand that you've risked everything to keep Eleanor safe." Barrett found himself oddly tongue-tied in the presence of actual European nobility, but Elena's encouraging smile gave him confidence. "Your daughter is a remarkable woman, Baroness. It's been my privilege to help her." Catherine Van Hollen smiled, the same radiant expression that transformed Elena's face. and Barrett could see where Elena had inherited both her beauty and her strength. "Please, call me Catherine, and I hope you'll forgive me for arriving unannounced. But I bring news that changes everything about your situation." Inside the ranch house, gathered around the kitchen table that had become their informal war room, Catherine Van Hollen revealed information that shifted the entire foundation of their conflict. The document Marcus used to justify his coup attempt, she began pulling a folded paper from her traveling bag, was a forgery. "I have the original death certificate that Marcus claimed showed Elena's death in a carriage bombing." She unfolded the paper carefully, an official-looking document bearing seals and signatures, but with telltale signs of forgery that Barrett's experienced eye could now detect. "Miguel helped me track down the forger in New Orleans," Catherine continued. "A man named Henri Dubois, who specializes in creating false documents for political purposes. Before he died, unfortunately he died of natural causes, before we could question him extensively, he confessed that Marcus had commissioned not just Elena's false death certificate, but also documents that would implicate me in treasonous activities." Elena leaned forward, her face intent. "What kind of treasonous activities?" "Funding revolutionary movements corresponding with enemies of the crown, embezzling funds from the Van Hollen estates to support democratic causes." Catherine ticked off the charges on her fingers. All technically true, but presented in a way that would justify not just Marcus taking control of our family holdings, but also having both of us executed as traitors to the Austrian crown. Frank whistled softly. "So this isn't just about family, money and politics. This is about preventing you from exposing Marcus's real activities." Catherine nodded grimly. "Marcus isn't just a conservative noble trying to maintain traditional power structures. He's been working with a consortium of European investors and political figures to actively suppress democratic movements and restore absolute monarchical control across Central Europe." The implications hit Barrett like a physical blow. So Elena wasn't just running for her life, she was carrying evidence that could expose an international conspiracy. "Exactly," Catherine confirmed. "And now that evidence is here in American territory, where Marcus and his allies have much less legal authority to operate." Tommy leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "No wonder they sent professional killers after her. This isn't about one family's inheritance. This is about the future of democracy in Europe." Miguel, who had been listening quietly to the conversation, finally spoke up. "There's more, Barrett. Catherine didn't just come here to reunite with Elena. She came with a proposal that could end this threat permanently." Catherine reached into her bag again and withdrew a leather portfolio tied with ribbon. "These are copies of all the evidence we've gathered against Marcus and his co-conspirators. Financial records, correspondence, testimony from witnesses who are now safely hidden in America." She untied the ribbon and spread several documents. On the table, Barrett could see financial ledgers, official letters bearing impressive seals, and what appeared to be signed confessions. "The original documents are now in the hands of American diplomatic authorities in Washington," Catherine continued. "But these copies represent enough evidence to expose the entire conspiracy. If we can get them to the right people in Europe, Marcus and his allies would be arrested for treason," Elena finished, understanding immediately. "The threat would be eliminated permanently, not just temporarily. But getting the evidence to Europe means someone has to carry it," Frank observed, "and Marcus's people will do everything they can to prevent that from happening." Catherine's expression grew resolute. "That's why I came personally. Elena and I together, mother and daughter, both with legitimate claims to the Van Hollen inheritance and both prepared to testify to the truth of these charges, represent an unassailable legal challenge to Marcus's coup." Barrett studied the documents, his mind working through the tactical implications. "This changes our defensive strategy completely. We're no longer just trying to keep Elena alive. We're trying to get both of you safely to a port where you can..." Book passage, back to Europe. The nearest major port is San Francisco, Miguel said, 800 miles through territory where Marcus's people have had weeks to establish surveillance and set traps. Elena looked around the table at the faces of the people who had become her unlikely allies, a reformed outlaw, his companions from darker days, and now her mother, who had crossed an ocean to find her. "There's something else we need to consider," she said quietly. "If we succeed in exposing Marcus and returning safely to Europe, what happens to the life I've built here?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Barrett felt his chest tighten as he realized what Elena was asking, not just about logistics or safety, but about the choice between two worlds and two very different futures. Catherine reached across the table and took her daughter's hand, her expression mixing understanding with maternal concern. "My dear, that's a choice only you can make. But remember that duty to our family and our people has always meant sacrifice." Elena's eyes met Barrett's across the table, and in that look he saw the same conflict he was feeling. They had found something precious in the midst of danger and uncertainty, but the real world, with its obligations and responsibilities, was intruding on their sanctuary. "One problem at a time," Barrett said finally, though his voice was rougher than he'd intended. "First we get you both to San Francisco alive, then we worry about what comes next." Frank leaned forward, studying the map Elena had drawn earlier. "If we're taking both ladies to California, we need to completely rethink our approach. Devil's Gate might work for a delaying action, but it won't work for a running fight across 800 miles. Miguel nodded, his strategic mind already working on the new problem. "We need to move fast, travel light, and stay ahead of their surveillance network. They'll be watching the main trails and stage routes." As the men began discussing travel routes and defensive strategies, Barrett found himself watching Eleanor and her mother. The reunion had transformed Elena in ways both subtle and profound. She carried herself with new confidence, but also with the weight of renewed responsibility to her family and their cause. The simple question of protecting one woman had become something far more complex, a mission that could influence the course of European politics and the future of democratic movements across the continent. Barrett realized that his quiet days as a reformed rancher weren't just temporarily interrupted. They were probably over forever. But as he looked at Elena, seeing the courage and intelligence that had first attracted him to her, now combined with the full authority of her noble heritage, Barrett found that he didn't regret the change. Some fights were worth everything you could give them, and this was becoming one of those fights. Outside, the desert night was settling over the ranch with its familiar sounds and scents. But tomorrow would bring the beginning of a journey that would test everything Barrett and his companions had learned about survival, loyalty, and the price of standing up for what was right. The preparations for their departure from the ranch took on the methodical intensity of a military operation. Barrett watched with growing respect as Elena and her mother worked together to organize the evidence that would expose Marcus's conspiracy. Documents carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, in copies made of the most crucial papers, and a detailed plan for who would carry what in case they were separated during the journey. But it was the transformation in Elena herself that struck Barrett most forcefully. The quiet, careful woman who had arrived at his ranch as collateral for a gambling debt was gone, replaced by someone who carried herself with the full authority of her noble birthright. She spoke with her mother in rapid French when they discussed European politics, switched to German when consulting documents from the Austrian territories, and demonstrated a grasp of international law that reminded Barrett that she'd been educated for leadership on a scale he could barely comprehend. "She's not the same person you've been protecting," Frank observed as they watched Elena and Catherine reviewing their travel route while consulting what appeared to be a diplomatic pouch full of official papers. "No," Barrett agreed, surprised by the mixture of pride and loss he felt. "She's becoming who she was, always meant to be." Miguel joined them on the porch, where they were conducting their own planning session. his face grim with news from his morning reconnaissance. "We've got problems. Garrett and his men aren't just watching the ranch anymore. They're setting up a network of observers along every major route between here and California." Barrett had been expecting this development, but hearing it confirmed still sent a chill down his spine. "How many men are we talking about?" "At least a dozen that I could identify, probably more that I missed," Miguel replied. "They're positioned at water sources, trail junctions, and anywhere travelers would naturally stop for supplies or rest. Professional setup, whoever's funding this operation isn't worried about the expense." Tommy looked up from the weapons he'd been cleaning and preparing. "So we can't use the main trails. What about backcountry routes?" "Possible," Miguel said, unfolding a detailed topographical map that showed terrain features most travelers never worried about. "But we'd be looking at twice the travel time, and we'd need to carry all our own water and supplies. Plus rough country favors whoever knows it best, and I'm betting Garrett's people have been scouting these mountains for weeks." Barrett studied the map, his mind working through the tactical challenges. Traveling through desert and mountain, wilderness with two women, one of whom had spent her life in European drawing rooms, was risky under the best of circumstances. Doing it while being hunted by professional killers with unlimited resources was approaching suicide. "There might be another option," Catherine said from the doorway. Barrett turned to see her holding a leather portfolio that he hadn't seen before. "I didn't mention this earlier because I hoped we could handle the situation without involving additional parties, but given our current circumstances..." She opened the portfolio to reveal official-looking documents bearing impressive seals and ribbons. "Before I left Europe, I was authorized to negotiate directly with American diplomatic authorities about this matter. The evidence against Marcus and his conspiracy is valuable enough that the American government has offered official protection in exchange for testimony before their intelligence services." Barrett felt his eyebrows rise. "You're talking about involving the federal government?" "Not just involving," Catherine clarified. "I have authorization to request military escort to San Francisco and from there to Washington for formal debriefing with State Department officials." Elena looked up from her own preparations, and Barrett could see both hope and concern in her expression. "Mother, using those credentials means we're committing to full disclosure of everything we know about Marcus's activities. That includes information about other European nobles who might be involved, even if they're not directly guilty of treason." "I know," Catherine replied quietly. "But Eleanor, we're beyond the point where we can protect people who've chosen to associate with conspirators. The evidence we have could prevent a war that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives." Frank leaned forward, his strategic mind engaging with the new information. "How would this military escort work? Where would we meet them?" Catherine consulted. Another document from the portfolio. "Fort Huachuca is the nearest major military installation, about 60 miles southeast of here. If I send word through diplomatic channels, they could have a cavalry escort ready to meet us within 48 hours." Miguel was already studying the route to Fort Huachuca on his map, tracing paths that would avoid the most obvious surveillance points. "It's doable. Rough country, but nothing we can't handle with proper preparation." Barrett found himself torn between relief at the prospect of professional military protection and reluctance to give up control of Elena's safety to strangers, even if they represented his own government. The possessive instinct surprised him. When had he started thinking of Elena's welfare as his personal responsibility, rather than simply the right thing to do? "There's one more consideration," Elena said quietly. "If we involve the American military and State Department, this stops being about my family's internal affairs and becomes an international diplomatic incident. That changes everything about what happens afterward." Barrett understood what she wasn't saying directly. Once, Elena testified before American intelligence services about European political conspiracies. She couldn't simply return to her old life. She'd be a valuable intelligence asset that governments would want to protect, control, or eliminate, depending on their interests. "Elena," Catherine said gently, "there may not be an afterward that allows for normal life. The evidence we carry implicates people at the highest levels of power in multiple countries. Even if we succeed in exposing Marcus, we'll likely spend the rest of our lives under some form of protection or surveillance." The weight of that statement settled over the group like a heavy blanket. Barrett realized that Elena wasn't just choosing between staying in America or returning to Europe. She was choosing between radically different versions of her future, none of which included the simple life they'd been building together at the ranch. Tommy, ever practical, broke the philosophical silence. "Well, sitting here debating long-term consequences won't help if we don't survive the next week. I say we get to Fort Huachuca, link up with this military escort, and worry about complicated politics after we're not being shot at anymore." Miguel nodded agreement. "Tommy's right. We can't plan for a future we might not live to see." That evening, as they made final preparations for departure at dawn, Barrett found himself working alongside Elena to pack supplies and ammunition. The familiar routine of preparing for a dangerous journey brought back memories from his outlaw days. The careful attention to detail that could mean the difference between success and disaster. The weight of weapons and supplies that represented survival in hostile territory, but this felt different from those earlier adventures. The stakes were higher, the enemies more dangerous, and the woman beside him wasn't a partner in criminal enterprise, but someone whose courage and character had fundamentally changed how he saw himself and his place in the world. "Barrett," Elena said as they worked, "I need you to know that whatever happens during this journey, these weeks at your ranch have been the most peaceful and genuine time of my adult life." Barrett stopped packing ammunition to look at her directly. In the lamplight, her face showed the strain of recent revelations and upcoming dangers, but also a strength and determination that made his chest tight with emotion he didn't quite know how to express. "Elena, you brought something to this ranch that I didn't even know was missing," he said. "You made it feel like a real home, instead of just a place where I was hiding from my past." She reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers warm and steady. "When this is over, when we've dealt with Marcus and the conspiracy and all the political complications, I want you to know that I'll find a way back to you. Whatever responsibilities I have to my family and my heritage, they don't change how I feel about what we've found together." Barrett lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, tasting the salt of honest work and feeling the calluses she'd developed from ranch life. "I'll be here waiting, no matter how long it takes." They held each other's gaze for a long moment, both understanding that they were making promises that might be impossible to keep, but needing to make them anyway. The future beyond their current crisis was uncertain in every detail except one. They had found something worth fighting for, and neither of them was willing to give it up without a struggle. Outside, Barrett could hear Frank and Tommy making final checks on their horses and equipment, while Miguel consulted his maps one last time to memorize the route that would take them away from the ranch and toward whatever resolution awaited them. Catherine sat at the kitchen table writing letters, final instructions to trusted agents in Europe, coded messages to allies in various governments, and what looked like personal correspondence to family members who needed to know the truth about recent events. As Barrett watched the Baroness work, he was struck by the scope of responsibility these women carried. His own concerns had never extended much beyond his personal survival and the welfare of his immediate companions. But Eleanor and her mother were thinking in terms of international politics, the welfare of thousands of workers and their families, and the future of democratic movements across an entire continent. Tomorrow, they would leave the ranch that had become Barrett's sanctuary, riding toward dangers that none of them could fully anticipate. The simple life he'd built in the Arizona desert was ending, replaced by something far more complicated and potentially more meaningful. Barrett looked around the ranch house that had sheltered and protected them during their brief time of peace. the stone fireplace that had warmed their evenings, the kitchen table where they'd planned their defense and discovered their feelings for each other, the bedroom where Eleanor had found safety after months of running and fear. He was leaving all of it behind, possibly forever, to help the woman. He'd come to love, navigate challenges that were beyond anything his outlaw experience had prepared him for. But as he watched Elena calmly preparing for whatever lay ahead, Barrett realized that the ranch had served its purpose. It had given them time to discover what they meant to each other, and that knowledge would have to be enough to sustain them. Through whatever came next, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and somewhere in the darkness, their enemies were preparing for the final confrontation that would determine not just their personal futures, but the fate of political movements that could change the course of history. Barrett reached for the custom holster rig he hadn't worn since his outlaw days, specially crafted leather that held his weapons with deadly efficiency, a symbol of the violent man he'd been before he found peace at the ranch. Tomorrow he would be that man again, but this time in service of something far more important than personal gain or survival. The journey to Fort Huachuca began before dawn, with the 5 riders moving through the desert darkness like ghosts haunting the borderland between night and day. Barrett had chosen a route that avoided the main trails, following deer paths and ancient Indian tracks that wound between towering saguaro cacti and through narrow arroyos carved by centuries of flash floods. Elena rode between Barrett and her mother, her posture straight and alert despite the early hour and the weight of responsibility she carried. The transformation from frontier ranch guest to European nobility was now complete. She wore traveling clothes appropriate for rough country, but her bearing spoke of someone accustomed to command, and the leather satchel containing crucial evidence never left her side. They had been riding for 3 hours when Miguel, scouting ahead, returned with news that confirmed Barrett's worst fears. "They're waiting for us," he reported quietly, his horse barely breathing hard despite the pace he'd maintained. At least 6 men positioned in the rocks overlooking Willow Creek, the only reliable water source for 20 miles in any direction. Barrett studied the terrain ahead, his tactical mind automatically assessing options. Willow Creek ran through a natural canyon where the walls rose steep and high on both sides, creating perfect positions for riflemen to command the entire approach. Anyone trying to reach the water would be exposed to concentrated fire from elevated positions. "Can we go round?" Frank asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Not without adding 2 days to our journey," Miguel replied, "and we're already carrying as much water as the horses can manage in this heat." Catherine Van Hollen, who had been listening to their tactical discussion with the focused attention of someone whose life had often depended on military planning, spoke up with quiet authority. "Gentlemen, I understand the risks, but we cannot afford a 2-day delay. My diplomatic authorization has a time limit. If we don't reach Fort Huachuca within the specified window, the military escort will be withdrawn." Elena's expression was troubled as she considered their options. "Mother, what happens if we miss the deadline?" "We'd be on our own for the remaining journey to San Francisco," Catherine replied grimly. 800 miles through territory, where Marcus's people have had weeks to prepare ambushes and establish surveillance. Barrett exchanged glances with Frank and Tommy, seeing his own thoughts reflected in their faces. They had faced impossible odds before, but never while protecting 2 people whose deaths could influence the political future of nations. "There is another option," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying a determination that made Barrett's stomach clench with foreboding. "A diversion. If some of us approach Willow Creek openly, while others circle around to attack from behind—" "No," Barrett said immediately, understanding what she was suggesting. "You're not using yourself as bait." Elena turned to face him fully, and Barrett saw in her eyes the steel that had allowed her to survive months of running from professional assassins. "Barrett, this isn't just about my personal safety anymore. The evidence I carry could prevent A war that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Sometimes the greater good requires personal risk. Frank had been studying the canyon through his field glasses, and now he lowered them with the expression of a man who'd reached an unpleasant but necessary conclusion. "She's right, Barrett. Those men are positioned to stop anyone from reaching the water, but they're not expecting an attack from behind. If we can get 2 or 3 people in position above them, the exposed approach would still be suicide," Tommy pointed out. "Even with covering fire, anyone riding openly toward that creek would be cut to pieces." Miguel had been quiet during their discussion, but now he spoke with the calm certainty of someone who'd made his decision. "Not if we time it right. There's a morning mist that rises from the creek just after sunrise, maybe 20 minutes of reduced visibility. If we attack from behind during that window, the confusion might be enough." Barrett found himself caught between tactical necessity and protective instinct. Everything about Elena mattered to him now, her safety, her mission, her future. But he could see that she was right about the stakes involved. This wasn't just about one woman's survival. It was about preventing a conspiracy that could plunge Europe into war. "All right," he said finally, his voice rough with reluctant acceptance. "But we do this my way, with maximum protection for both ladies." The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. Frank and Tommy would circle around to approach the ambush positions from behind, using the broken terrain to stay hidden until they could get within effective range. Barrett would accompany Elena and Catherine in the direct approach, relying on the morning mist and the distraction created by Frank and Tommy's attack to reach cover near the creek. As they prepared to separate, Elena approached Barrett with something wrapped in silk cloth. She unfolded the wrapping to reveal her mother's crown, a delicate circlet of gold and precious stones that had been worn by Van Hollen women for generations. "Barrett, I need you to understand something," she said, placing the crown carefully in his hands. "If something happens to me today, this belongs to my mother's heir, which would be my cousin Margaret in Vienna. But more than that, it represents everything my family has tried to build and protect." Barrett looked at the crown, feeling the weight of centuries in the delicate metalwork. "Elena, you're going to survive this. We're all going to survive this." "Perhaps," she replied, but her eyes showed the realism of someone who'd faced death before. "But if we don't, I need you to know that these weeks with you have given me something I never expected to find, a glimpse of what life could be like when it's not defined entirely by duty and obligation." Barrett wrapped the crown carefully and tucked it inside his saddlebags, but his attention was entirely focused on Elena's face. "When this is over, we're going to find out what the rest of that life looks like." She smiled then, the radiant expression that had first made Barrett's heart skip, and rose on her toes to kiss him gently. "I'm going to hold you to that promise, Mr. Callahan." The morning mist rose from Willow Creek like the spirits of ancient warriors, providing the cover they needed for what Barrett knew would be the most dangerous few minutes of their lives. Frank and Tommy had disappeared into the rocks above the canyon an hour earlier, and Barrett could only hope they were in position for the coordinated attack that would determine whether Elena and her mother lived or died. Barrett checked his weapons one final time, the matched Colts at his hips, the Winchester rifle across his saddle, and a hideout gun in his boot that had saved his life more than once during his outlaw days. Beside him, Elena sat her horse with the calm composure of someone who had accepted whatever fate awaited them, while Catherine Van Hollen clutched the leather portfolio containing evidence that could change the course of European history. "Remember," Barrett said quietly, "when the shooting starts, you ride hard for those rocks near the creek and don't look back. I'll be right behind you, but your job is to get that evidence to Fort Huachuca, no matter what happens to the rest of us." Elena met his eyes with a look that spoke of love and determination in equal measure. "Barrett, whatever happens today, I want you to know that you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever, hope for a future worth living." Before Barrett could respond, the sharp crack of rifle fire echoed from the canyon walls above them. Frank and Tommy had begun their assault on the ambush positions, and Barrett could hear shouts of alarm and confusion from Garrett's men as they found themselves under attack from an unexpected direction. Now, Barrett spurred his horse forward, with Eleanor and Catherine riding hard beside him as they raced toward the creek through the swirling mist. The sound of gunfire intensified above them, and Barrett caught glimpses of muzzle flashes among the rocks as Frank and Tommy pressed their attack. But Garrett had positioned his men well. Even caught by surprise, the professional killers adapted quickly to the changing tactical situation. Barrett saw one of them swing his rifle toward their approaching group, and only Eleanor's quick reflexes, ducking low over her horse's neck, saved her from the shot that whined past her head. Barrett returned fire with his Winchester, the familiar weight of the weapon bringing back skills he'd honed during the darkest period of his life. His shot took the rifleman in the shoulder, spinning him around and buying them precious seconds to reach the cover of the rocks near the creek. They dismounted in a tumble of movement and adrenaline, dragging their saddlebags and the crucial evidence portfolio into the shelter of a natural fortress created by centuries of erosion. Catherine Van Hollen, despite her aristocratic upbringing, moved with the efficiency of someone who had faced danger before, while Elena checked their ammunition and prepared defensive positions with the competence Barrett had come to expect. From her, the battle above them continued with deadly intensity. Barrett could distinguish the reports of Frank and Tommy's weapons from those of their enemies, and the tactical situation seemed to be shifting in their favor. But then he heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of approaching horses from the direction they'd traveled. Reinforcements, he said grimly, recognizing the trap that Garrett had prepared. The ambush at Willow Creek hadn't been intended to stop them entirely. It had been designed to pin them down, while additional men closed the escape route behind them. Elena peered around the rock formation that sheltered them and counted the approaching riders. At least 8 men, maybe more. Professional cavalry formation. Barrett's mind raced through their tactical options, none of which offered much hope for survival against professional killers attacking from 2 directions simultaneously. But as he prepared to make their last stand as costly as possible for their enemies, he heard something that changed everything, the distant sound of a military bugle echoing across the desert. Catherine Van Hollen's face lit up with desperate hope. The cavalry escort from Fort Huachuca, they're early. Barrett looked toward the sound and saw dust clouds on the horizon that could only mean a large body of mounted men approaching at full gallop. But whether the military escort would arrive in time to prevent massacre remained an open question. The gunfire from above intensified as Frank and Tommy realized that their tactical situation had become critical. Barrett could see Garrett's reinforcements positioning themselves to attack their rock shelter, while the original ambush party tried to disengage from Frank and Tommy's assault to support the final assault. Elena, Barrett said, checking his ammunition one final time. No matter what happens in the next few minutes, that evidence has to reach American authorities. Promise me. Elena looked at him with eyes that held love, determination, and the kind of courage that had allowed her ancestors to hold their lands against overwhelming odds for centuries. I promise. But Barrett, we're going to survive this together. Barrett smiled grimly and levered around into his Winchester's chamber. Then let's make sure these bastards know they've been in a real fight. The final battle for Eleanor's life and the evidence that could prevent a European war was about to begin, with professional killers closing from 2 directions and salvation racing across the desert in the form of United States cavalry. Barrett had been in desperate fights before, but never with stakes this high, and never protecting someone whose survival meant more to him than his own life. As he took aim at the first of Garrett's men to expose himself, Barrett found himself thinking that some fights were worth everything you could give them, and this was definitely one of those fights. 6 months later, Barrett Callahan stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching the Arizona sunset paint the desert in familiar shades of gold and crimson. The bullet scar on his left shoulder still ached when the weather changed, a permanent reminder of those desperate minutes at Willow Creek when professional killers had tried to prevent Elena and her evidence from reaching safety. The cavalry had arrived just as Barrett's ammunition was running low and Garrett's men were preparing their final assault. The thunder of hooves and the sight of uniformed soldiers charging across the desert had been the most beautiful thing Barrett had ever seen, even more beautiful than Elena's face when she realized they were going to survive. The aftermath had been swift and decisive. Garrett and most of his men were killed in the final firefight, though a few had escaped into the desert. More importantly, Eleanor and Catherine Van Hollen had reached Fort Huachuca safely, with their evidence intact, beginning a chain of diplomatic and legal actions that would ultimately expose Marcus Van Hollen's conspiracy and restore the family's rightful control over their estates. Barrett smiled as he remembered Elena's testimony before the State Department. Officials in Washington, calm, precise, and devastatingly effective. The woman who had stood silent in Murphy's saloon had revealed herself to be a formidable political force when fighting for causes she believed in. The evidence she carried had indeed prevented a war, leading to arrests across 3 countries and the collapse of the conspiracy that had threatened democratic movements throughout Europe. The sound of an approaching carriage interrupted his memories, and Barrett felt his heart quicken as he recognized the elegant black vehicle that had become a familiar sight at the ranch over the past month. Elena had returned from Europe 3 weeks ago, but she was still adjusting to the idea that her dangerous exile was finally over and she could build the life she'd always wanted. Elena stepped down from the carriage with the same grace that had first caught Barrett's attention, but now she wore it without the careful restraint of someone constantly alert for danger. Her traveling dress was practical but elegant, suitable for the frontier but clearly expensive, and she moved toward the porch with the confidence of someone who had faced the worst life could offer and survived. "How was town?" Barrett asked. As she climbed the porch steps, though his attention was focused entirely on her face and the way the evening light caught the gold threads in her dark hair. "Productive," Elena replied, setting down a leather portfolio that Barrett recognized as containing legal documents related to their future. "The territorial governor has approved our application for the land grant, and the banker in Tucson has agreed to the terms for expanding the ranch operations." Barrett raised an eyebrow. The land grant Elena mentioned would triple the size of his ranch, while the expansion plans involved building facilities that would make the Rocking Sea one of the largest cattle operations in the territory. "You've been busy." Elena smiled, the radiant expression that still made Barrett's chest tight with emotion he didn't completely understand. "I've been planning our future. That is, if you're still interested in having a future with a former European princess who comes with complicated political connections." Barrett reached into his vest pocket and withdrew something he'd been carrying for weeks, a simple ring forged from iron found on his ranch, heated in his own forge and shaped with his own hands. It wasn't elegant or valuable, but it represented something that all the gold and jewels in European treasuries couldn't match. "Elena Van Hollen," he said, dropping to one knee on the porch of the ranch house where they'd discovered their love for each other. "Will you marry me?" Elena's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was brighter than the sunset painting the desert around them. "Barrett Callahan, I thought you'd never ask." As Barrett slipped the ring onto Elena's finger, a simple band that somehow managed to look perfect next to the Van Hollen signet she still wore, he reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. A year ago, he'd been a solitary rancher trying to forget his violent past. Now he was preparing to marry European nobility and become part of political and business enterprises that spanned continents. "Are you sure about this?" he asked as they sat together on the porch swing, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. Your mother has offered us a palace in Austria, business interests that would make us wealthy beyond anything I ever imagined, and a life of luxury and influence." Elena leaned against his shoulder, her hand finding his with the natural ease of long practice. "Barrett, I've lived that life of luxury and influence. It has its satisfactions, but it doesn't have what I found with you: peace, honesty, and the knowledge that the person beside me chose to be there because of love, rather than obligation or political advantage." Barrett kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of lavender that still clung to her, despite months of frontier living. "So we build something new here. Part European sophistication, part American frontier practicality." "Exactly," Elena agreed. "A place where political refugees and people starting over can find sanctuary, where different worlds can meet and learn from each other." She gestured toward the valley that spread out below the ranch house. "We'll expand the cattle operation, but also establish schools and medical facilities for the workers and their families. Your mother's foundation will provide funding, and we'll create something that honors both our histories." Barrett thought about Frank, Tommy, and Miguel, who had all decided to stay in the area and help with the ranch expansion. His old companions, from darker days, had found their own form of redemption in building something constructive rather than destructive. Even Catherine Van Hollen had decided to spend part of each year in Arizona, fascinated by the opportunity to establish European-style, progressive institutions in American frontier conditions. "What about children?" Barrett asked, surprising himself with the question. Elena turned to look at him directly, her eyes bright with possibilities. "I want children who grow up understanding both worlds, the responsibilities that come with privilege and the independence that comes from building something with your own hands. Children who know that honor means protecting people who can't protect themselves, and that love is worth fighting for even when the odds seem impossible." As they sat together on the porch where they'd planned their defense against professional killers, watched sunsets during their brief time of peace, and now planned a future that would honor both their heritages, Barrett realized that some gambles paid off in ways you never expected. He'd accepted Elena as payment for a poker debt, thinking he was just helping someone in trouble. Instead, he'd found the missing piece of his life, someone who understood that true strength came from standing up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. Someone who could move between palace and frontier ranch house with equal grace, who could face down international conspiracies and still find joy in simple pleasures like desert sunsets and morning coffee shared in comfortable silence. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, along with the promise of seasons to come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they worked to build the life they'd envisioned together, but tonight they had each other and the knowledge that love could indeed conquer impossible odds when it was supported by courage, honor, and the willingness to fight for what mattered most. Barrett reached for Elena's hand, feeling the simple iron ring he'd made beside the ancient gold of her family heritage, and smiled at the symbolism. Two different worlds, finding common ground in the vast Arizona desert where anything was possible if you were brave enough to reach for it.